We ran between the barracks, lungs burning, feet pounding against the hard-packed earth, me and another Lithuanian whose name I can scarcely remember now, only the terror in his eyes. We were running from a tank, a T-34, the machine that had saved the motherland during the war, now slowly, methodically moving behind us in the camp zone. The engine roared like a beast, the treads grinding the soil with a terrible, rhythmic clanking. Suddenly, above the mechanical din, we heard a deafening bang, a cannon shot or perhaps a high-caliber round close by. Something warm and wet splashed heavily onto my back and neck. Blood, thick and metallic. I looked back, terrified of what I would see, and there was a still headless man running behind me, momentum carrying him forward for 1-2 horrific seconds before the body realized it was dead and collapsed into the dust. Recalled years later, these are the nightmares that haunt Sergei Dedyukin, one of the survivors of that fateful day. His memory captures the sheer, surreal brutality of the suppression of the Kengir uprising, a moment when the Soviet state turned its weapons of war not against a foreign invader, but against its own prisoners. Although it was neither the first nor the largest uprising in the shadowy history of the Gulag, the Kengir events of May and June 1954 have become etched in history as one of the most intense, organized, and ultimately tragic in terms of the sheer number of victims. For 40 days, a strange, desperate freedom flourished behind barbed wire, only to be crushed under the treads of tanks. The process of the Kengir uprising and its bloody aftermath became widely known to the world thanks to the chapter The 40 Days of Kengir in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's monumental The Gulag Archipelago. Later, especially following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the archives creaked open. Memoirs were published, survivors spoke, and from these fragmented voices we reconstruct the anatomy of a tragedy. To understand Kengir, one must understand the people who were caged there. The overwhelming majority of the participants in the uprising were not common criminals, but political prisoners, the 58ths, named after the infamous Article 58 of the Soviet Penal Code. These were men and women hardened by war and betrayal. They included members of the Red Army who had survived Nazi prisoner of war camps, only to be branded traitors by Stalin upon their return. There were participants in the fierce anti-Soviet resistance movements that had fought long after the official end of World War II, the Forest Brothers, anti-communist partisans from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania who had waged a guerrilla war from the Baltic woodlands, and the steely members of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, who brought military discipline and organization into the camps. For people of this caliber, men and women who had already looked death in the face and whom the Soviet point of view deemed extremely dangerous, the standard camp system was considered insufficient. In 1948, the MVD established the so-called special camps, osologs. These were intended to be black holes from which no light escaped. One of these was Steplag, the steppe camp. Its headquarters sat in the dusty town of Zhezkazgan, in the heart of the endless, wind-swept steppes of present-day Kazakhstan, a landscape of scorching summers and bone-chilling winters, where the horizon seems to stretch into eternity. Its third camp detachment was located in the settlement of Kengir, now a suburb of Zhezkazgan. It was here that the pressure cooker finally exploded. The regime in Steplag was designed to break the human spirit more thoroughly than the regular Gulag camps. Here, correspondence was banned. A prisoner was cut off from the world, dead to their family. The isolation was absolute. The work was more strenuous, the rations smaller, the guards more brutal. And, in a final act of dehumanization, names were taken away. Prisoners wore uniforms with numbers sewn onto the backs, chests, and knees. They were no longer Ivan or Pyotr. They were Ivan 32 or Slon 450. The investigative files of the Kengir uprising dusted off decades later, paint a staggering picture of the scale. As of June 10, 1954, a total of 20,698 people were imprisoned in the 6 camp wards of Steplag. 16,677 men and 4,021 women. In the 3rd camp ward in Kengir, the epicenter of the revolt, there were 5,617 prisoners, 3,203 men and 2,414 women. When the uprising began, almost the entire population of the 3rd Ward, regardless of nationality or background, joined the revolt. The composition of the prisoners was a tragic tapestry of the Soviet Empire and beyond. In total, 22 nationalities from the Soviet Union's internal regions were represented in Steplag. Belarusians, Armenians, Moldovans, Kazakhs, Georgians, Tatars, Ingush, and Turkmen. The international reach of the purge was evident in the 17 foreign nationalities represented: Poles, Englishmen, Germans, Chinese, and even Americans caught in the gears of history. However, the demographic core of the camp was distinct. Most prisoners came from Ukraine or the Baltic states, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians. Russians, usually the majority in the general population, were here a minority. This demographic is crucial. The Ukrainians and Balts brought with them a history of partisan warfare, underground organization, and a profound hatred for the Soviet system. According to data from the Russian State Archive, the lists of prisoners in Kengir in early 1953 also showed traces of Central European tragedy: 31 people convicted of espionage for Czechoslovakia and 18 people holding Czech nationality. Unfortunately, the mists of time and the chaotic nature of record-keeping mean we do not yet know the specific names and fates of these individuals. We cannot say with certainty if Czechs stood on the barricades in Kengir, but as more archives in Kazakhstan open, we hope to one day reclaim their stories from oblivion. Daily life in Kengir was a slow death. Prisoners worked in slave-like conditions, primarily in the copper, manganese, in coal mines, or in the stone quarries and brickworks that fed the Soviet industrial machine. Kengir was notorious. The air was constantly filled with dust, red dust from the copper, black dust from the coal. The lifespan of prisoners assigned to the copper mines was terrifyingly short. The fine particulate matter coated the lungs, and newcomers often fell ill with silicosis or tuberculosis within 3 to 5 months. They were expendable biological units, easily replaced by the next trainload of convicts. Vagarshak Batayan, an Armenian survivor who endured a total of 14 years in the camps, described Kengir of 1952 vividly. He had been arrested a second time, sentenced to another 10 years, and transported to the harsh Kazakh wilds. He recalled, "The huge area of the camp was surrounded by massive stone walls about 4 meters high. Above them were several rows of barbed wire, creating a cage within a cage. Towers loomed at the corners, from which the camp was constantly watched by armed guards with machine guns. Inside, walls of the same height divided the camp into 4 differently sized zones, segregating men from women and politicals from the service yards. In each zone stood the barracks, dug about 1 meter into the ground to provide insulation against the steppe wind, with small barred windows peering out from under the roof like suspicious eyes. The floors were made of beaten clay, cold and damp. Along the main axis lay the mess hall, the baths, the infirmary, and the office with the accounting department, the administrative heart of our misery. But why did the uprising happen? Why there, and why then? The seeds were sown in Moscow. After Stalin's death in March 1953 and the subsequent execution of his terrifying spy chief, Lavrentiy Beria, a ripple of expectation went through the Gulag. Prisoners eagerly awaited a general amnesty, or at least significant reform. But for the political prisoners of the special camps, the amnesty of 1953 was a cruel joke. It applied mostly to common criminals and those with short sentences, leaving the spies and counter-revolutionaries to rot. However, Beria's fall changed the psychology of power. A paranoid fear of losing privileged positions began to spread through the highest levels of Soviet structures. In the Gulag archipelago, Solzhenitsyn describes this atmosphere of uncertainty, the cracking of the monolith. The guards did not know what was required of them, he wrote. To make a mistake could have had fatal consequences. If they had shown too much zeal and started shooting prisoners, they could have ended up like Beria's henchmen, purged for excesses. If they had not been active enough and forced the strikers to work, they could have met the same fate for incompetence. Everyone, guards, administrators, and prisoners alike, felt the crisis. The camp leadership, sensing their authority slipping as riots and hunger strikes erupted across the Gulag system, panicked. They desperately tried to maintain their dominant position by punishing prisoners in an exemplary, brutal manner. They tightened the screws just as the metal was beginning to fatigue. Already in 1953 and early 1954, there were violent incidents in Steplag where guards opened fire on prisoners for minor infractions. But the immediate impetus for the Kengir uprising was a massacre. In a confrontation, a guard fired a machine gun into a group of prisoners, killing 13 and seriously wounding more than 30. The blood soaked into the dry ground, and with it, the last shreds of the prisoners' patience evaporated. The riot occurred the very next day. Individual accounts of the beginning of the uprising differ in small details, but the basic narrative arc is consistent. It began on Sunday, May 16, 1954. It was a rest day. The prisoners were in the camp, not the mines. The catalyst came from an unexpected source: the criminal prisoners, the Blatny. The camp authorities, in a misguided attempt to divide and conquer, had transferred a group of hardened criminals into the political camp, thinking the criminals would terrorize the fascists and dampen the growing discontent. It backfired. The criminals, sensing the weakness of the administration, decided to break into the food stores in the farm sector and, more audaciously, into the women's zone. Political prisoner Nikolai Kekashev recalls the surreal scene in the men's section. The criminals, calmly and without shouting, passed through our zone. To the surprise of all of us, they broke down the gate of the farmyard and, just as calmly, began to smash through the adobe wall separating us from the women. The political prisoners did not stand idly by. They followed the criminals, ostensibly to protect the women from assault. But when the wall was breached, something unexpected happened. There was no violence between the prisoners. The criminal prisoners were quite scared, recalls Lubov Bershetskia. They wouldn't dare to do anything wrong to the women. They behaved in such a way that we didn't even realize they were criminals at first. They were caught up in the energy of the moment. From the women's side, the view was chaotic. We noticed men jumping over the wall, Bershetskia continues. Some had ropes, others ladders improvised from bunk boards. It was a continuous stream of gray uniforms. There were 170 in all, 100 politicals and 70 criminals. Women started running out of the barracks, confusion on their faces. The fact that men appeared in the women's section stunned them. The hole in the wall widened. Hundreds of men streamed through. For a few hours, the segregated zones merged, but the guards, recovering from their shock, opened fire from the towers. Tracers lit up the evening sky. 13 people died on the spot, 5 more succumbed to wounds later, and dozens were maimed. The prisoners were treated. An uneasy calm settled over the camp as night fell. On Monday, May 17th, the administration tried to reassert control. The prisoners were forced out to work. While the camp was empty, the guards frantically repaired the wall and declared the space between zones a firing zone.
justifying it with lies about robberies and rapes committed by the men. This fabrication enraged the prisoners. They knew the truth, that the breach had been an act of defiance, not depravity. That evening, when they returned from the mines, a second, larger wave of men, about 400, stormed the repaired wall. They tore it down with their bare hands and tools smuggled from work.
By May 18th, the rebellion was total. More than 3,000 people refused to go to work. The strike had begun. The guards, outnumbered and fearful of the organized hatred facing them, fled the zone, barricading themselves in the administrative buildings or retreating outside the perimeter. The insurgents tore down the wall completely and stormed the internal prison, the boer, and the solitary confinement block, freeing 252 prisoners who had been held there for interrogation or punishment. The spark became a wildfire. The entire 3rd Camp Division of Steplag was effectively a free territory. It was in this liberated atmosphere that Yuri Grunin, a man captured by the Germans during the war and later sentenced to 10 years as a traitor, entered the women's zone. In his 1999 book, Spina Zemli, The Spine of the Earth, he recalls the surreal moment. He had been exchanging secret letters with a 25-year-old Ukrainian woman named Hanna Ramska for a year, but they had never met. On the other side of the ruins of the wall, women stood looking at the men who came to them. In one of them, I recognized her, from the pencil portrait she had sent me a year earlier. Amidst the wreckage of their prison, Yuri and Hanna met. Like many others, they could finally hold hands. The human spirit's resilience was on full display. Although separated by walls and wire for years, men and women had found ways to connect, throwing notes wrapped in rocks over fences, hiding letters in bread rations, or bribing sympathetic guards. Now, with the walls down, these paper romances became real. Priests imprisoned in the camp, Orthodox, Catholic, Lutheran, performed marriage ceremonies. Women sewed improvised wedding dresses from sheets. Men polished their boots. The love stories of Kengir are heartbreakingly romantic, a desperate affirmation of life in the shadow of death. But as history would show, many would not have a happy ending. The rebels were not a mob, they were an army without weapons. The Ukrainian and Baltic partisans took charge of organization. Work brigades were converted into platoons and companies. A self-governing prisoners' republic was established on May 19th. A commission was elected to negotiate with the authorities, consisting of 6 people, 4 men and 2 women. Kapitan Kuznetsov, a former Red Army colonel, became its chairman. Kuznetsov was a pragmatist. His first decisive order was to replace anti-Soviet slogans with communist ones. He argued that the revolt would survive if it was framed not as an anti-Soviet rebellion, but as a demand for the restoration of Soviet legality. Down with the murderers in the administration was acceptable. Down with communism was not. By formally adhering to the Soviet spirit, painting signs like "Long live the Soviet Constitution," they hoped to confuse the authorities and buy time. The strategic genius of the uprising lay in its demands. The rebels demanded an 8-hour workday, the lifting of limits on correspondence, the removal of humiliating number patches, and the prosecution of the guards responsible for the shootings. None of these demands were unconstitutional. They were merely asking the state to follow its own written laws. To stall for time, they demanded to speak to a member of the Central Committee from Moscow. And so they waited for 40 days.
During these 40 days, Kengir was transformed. The camp contained a cross-section of the intelligentsia, writers, engineers, artists, mechanics. Kuznetsov established departments: economy, security, food, agitation, and propaganda. The technical department worked miracles. In secret workshops, they forged weapons from window bars and scrap metal, knives, sabers, and crude pikes. They made improvised grenades from mining explosives in glass jars. They even managed to restore electricity to the camp after the authorities cut the lines, using a generator improvised from a motor. Cultural life exploded. The camp radio, rigged up by engineers, broadcast news and poetry. A wall newspaper was published. There were concerts and plays. The propaganda department fought a psychological war, while the Soviet authorities spread rumors in the nearby settlements that the prisoners were savages, raping women and killing civilians. The prisoners fought back. They used shortwave transmitters to send Morse code messages into the ether. They built kites and balloons capable of carrying leaflets, launching them on the steppe winds to drift over the town of Zhezkazgan, telling the civilians, "We are not murderers, we are victims seeking justice." But the Soviet state does not negotiate with prisoners. It waits. On June 25th, the prisoners received a message. Their demands would be met. A collective sigh of relief went through the zone. It seemed they had won. In the euphoria, vigilance slipped. The sentries relaxed. No one paid enough attention to the low, rumbling noise that had been building on the steppe for days. The sound of tractors, the authorities said. In reality, the tractor engines were being revved to mask the approach of T-34 tanks and military trucks. At 3:30 a.m. on June 26th, the sky ripped open. Signal flares hissed into the dawn, bathing the camp in an eerie red light. The suppression had begun. Snipers, positioned in the darkness, picked off the patrols on the roofs of the barracks before they could sound the alarm. Then came the roar. 5 T-34 tanks breached the perimeter fence, tearing through the barbed wire as if it were thread. Behind them came 98 trained attack dogs and 1,700 soldiers in full combat gear, special forces, armed with automatic weapons. Norma Schickman remembers the shock of waking to the apocalypse. I ran out of the house, and suddenly I saw a tank entering the gate. We were standing by the wall, and the tank came awfully close to us, the heat of its engine hitting our faces. I understood then. The situation was not just bad, it was the end. Lyubov Bershadatsky, a member of the commission, watched in disbelief. As the prisoners, completely confused and frightened, ran around the camp, the gate opened and 4 more tanks appeared, driving straight into the people. They didn't slow down. The horror that followed is difficult to articulate. The tanks were not just for intimidation, they were weapons of mass destruction. Anna Grichenik-Witt describes the scene. A tank approached the barracks and started firing blanks to disorient us. Everyone was standing along the walls, freezing in terror. I've never seen something so terrible. The tank was coming straight at us. My husband immediately understood that they were there to kill. He threw me aside and shouted to the others to run. But for some, it was too late. Maria Montika and Zenka, a young couple from my husband's brigade, fell under the tank's tread. They were crushed together. They were finishing their sentences. They wanted to start a family. They were buried in the same grave. The violence was indiscriminate. Women, who formed a human chain to protect the men, believing the soldiers wouldn't shoot women, were mown down. Guri Cherepanov gives one of the most harrowing accounts of the slaughter. He and his beloved, Alla, were caught in the open. The tank was heading straight at us, driving slowly but inexorably. Alla and I were in the front. Everyone was backing up, trying to hide in the barracks, but the tank started to push the women. It crashed into them. It is hard to describe what happens when a tank bites into a mass of people. It was a nightmare. Alla was lost to me in the crowd. I jumped onto the armor of the tank to avoid being crushed and heard her voice. She was calling me. The tank drove on, and the ground behind it remained littered with crushed bodies.
Cherepanov survived the initial pass, but the scene he found afterward broke him. The Soviet tank triumphantly left behind mutilated women and men. I was looking for Allah, but it was not quite dawn yet, only the fires lit the darkness. Finally, I saw her sitting by the barrack. She was reaching out her arms to me. She was covered in blood. Her flesh was torn from her back. One of her legs was completely torn out of her pelvis, held on only by skin. I froze in terror. I prayed to God I wouldn't faint. When I tried to lift her, my hand was covered up to my elbow with small pieces of flesh, human flesh, the flesh of a young woman, the flesh of my beloved. I wiped my hand with a handkerchief. I still have it. Parts of Allah still remain on it to this day.
The battle raged. Soldiers stormed the barracks, firing indiscriminately. "We put Allah on a stretcher," Cherepanov says. "She put her cold arms around me, and we kissed one last time. She died there. I walked over to her bed, sat down, and cried out loud, not just for her, but from the sheer, absolute helplessness." Bershadskaya, amidst the smoke and screams, stared at the destruction. The whole camp had turned into ruins. Dead and wounded were lying everywhere. Tanks were crushing the living. Within seconds, I could see the brains and entrails of my friends splashed on the walls of the barracks, friends with whom I had shared grief for so many years. As the sun rose, the shooting stopped. The operation had lasted about 90 minutes. Medics were allowed into the zone, but the scale of the carnage overwhelmed them. From all sides, prisoners began bringing in wounded, moaning and screaming fellow prisoners in blankets, Bershadskaya describes. She assisted the camp doctor in a futile triage. Mostly, they were dying right on the table, looking at us with fading eyes and saying, "Write to mother, write to my children." The surgeon worked for 13 hours straight before collapsing from exhaustion and trauma. Official correspondence between Sergei Yegorov, the head of the Gulag administration, and Minister of Internal Affairs Sergei Kruglov confirms that the prisoners fought back with desperate bravery. They used homemade grenades, pistols, spades, iron bars, and stones. But stones do not stop tanks. The soldiers had fired rockets and heavy machine guns. The toll was catastrophic. Official numbers are notoriously unreliable, but historian Turganbek Alanyazov estimates between 60 and 300 dead, with hundreds more wounded. Hanna Boretska describes the aftermath. The zone was covered in blood. Soldiers loaded the mutilated bodies of the rebels onto trucks like logs. We survivors were lined up and marched out to the steppe. Ilko Tafichuk witnessed the burial. The ground was soaked. When the dust settled, trucks entered the zone. Out in the steppe, excavators had already dug mass graves. I saw not only the dead, but also the wounded, those unlikely to survive, being thrown onto the trucks. They were still breathing when they were buried with the dead. The earth moved for hours after the bulldozers finished. The survivors were held in the scorching steppe for days without shelter. When they were finally marched back into the camp, the efficiency of the Soviet system had erased the crime. Yuri Grunin recalls the chilling sight. On the evening of the third day, we were brought back. All the walls were rebuilt, plastered, and whitewashed. The bloodstains were gone, the trenches filled in, the flowers planted. Welcome, gentlemen. Quietly and peacefully, we dispersed to our barracks and waited to be called to dinner. After all, we had to go to work at dawn the next day. The reprisals followed. A total of 436 active rebels were arrested. 36 leaders, including Kuznetsov, who controversially survived, leading to rumors of collaboration, were tried. 6 were sentenced to death, 3 were executed. 1,000 supporters were shipped off to the frozen hells of Kolyma, Berlog, or the Ozerlog railway construction, Ozerlog. Yet, the blood of Kengir was not spilled in vain.
The uprising was a shock to the system. It proved that the camps were no longer manageable by terror alone. The Kengir Rebellion, along with others in Vorkuta and Norilsk, forced the Kremlin's hand. A review of cases began. The special camps were dismantled. Within a few years, 2/3 of the political prisoners were released. In 1960, the Gulag system was officially reorganized and significantly reduced. The Soviet Union would last another 30 years, but the totalitarian perfection of the Stalinist camp system died in the dust of Kengir. It has been 70 years since that bloody dawn of June 26, 1954. Today, on the southeast edge of Zhezkazgan, amidst modern industrial sprawl, the ghosts of Steplag remain. The ruins of the barracks, the crumbling walls of the canteen, and the shell of the camp club stand silent witnesses. A 300-meter section of the adobe wall, the very wall that was breached to start the uprising, still stands, weathered by the relentless steppe wind. Thanks to local historians like Turganbek Alanyazov and researchers from Gulag.cz, these remnants are being documented. Information boards now mark the site, but the vast majority of the camp is lost to time and new construction. Yet, standing there, one can almost hear the echo of the tank treads, the desperate prayers of the weddings, and the defiant shouts of a people who, for 40 days, were free.